His Honor the President.
You already know.
Senator Tate, you are our next speaker.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, my interest in these two pieces of proposed legislation is really in relation to what I see are areas of concern for me. First of all, we have the Recommended Utilities Regulations Amendment Act, Bill 2019. I believe that's what Senator McConnell said we're going to amend it to. And with this piece of legislation, we basically have a situation, Mr. President, where due to unaudited books, we have a new piece of legislation that will give a minister of government unfettered powers, I would think. And I'm wondering, I'm seeking to understand, and don't get me wrong, I understand we have a challenge, and you, Mr. President, said it would take a long time to fix the books, and I believe the Honourable Prime Minister made reference to the fact that the books are unaudited, and it's a terrible thing. We had Senator McConnell and Senator Adams explaining to us that this is not a good thing, and I understand that we have things to do. We have challenges with water. We are in crisis. We have dire situation as it relates to our water. My thing is, though, that everything is dire, and I'm wondering if it is that it is okay, because something is dire, not to do something properly. And I don't think that is correct, and I don't think that is the way that we should go. Everything is always, we must do this. This may not be the best way, but let's not worry about getting it as close as possible to the best way because it's dire. So if I understand Senator McConnell's submissions earlier this afternoon, we've taken the regulation of utilities, because let us not be confused. The proposed amendment does not just say for water, it speaks to the minister being able to exempt a utility service. So who is to say that all of those utility or entities that are being regulated by the Fair Trading Commission will not fall under the umbrella of this proposed amendment? And that concerns me, because as a former Fair Trading Commissioner, I had the distinct pleasure and privilege of observing the qualified people and men and women who work at the Fair Trading Commission, and to be a part of their methodology and how they do things. We have some excellent, highly qualified, well-trained people at the Fair Trading Commission who know what they're doing, who are highly trained, who work within a framework that is sometimes, to my mind, even though it was in English, they needed to break it down for me. So you could follow, and they were governed by legislation, policies, practices. So to take regulation from that type of body and put it in the hands of a minister, where the regulation and the proposed amendment is 4 lines, and it doesn't tell you the framework within which the minister is going to work, is of concern to me. Because at least with the Fair Trading Commission, you knew the framework within which those individuals were going to be working. So my question would be, rather than create legislation to give a minister power to regulate, why not remove the need for the audited books from what the Fair Trading Commission is supposed to do, and let them do everything else that they do as part of their regulation process? so that you still have a body of highly trained men and women who follow a framework of regulation, who can regulate our utilities. I'm just asking because what was told to us was that our books are not up to date. That's the only reason, as I understand it, that we are unable to do, that we've had to get the minister with this power. Because failing that, how do we know the extent of his power? And with a government that spoke much about transparency, one would expect that you would have an explanation as to the extent that the minister can and will go. And please understand me, I'm not speaking about the particular minister, but a minister responsible for utilities or a particular utility. And because this amendment has been made to coincide with the situation at Water Authority, I think people are forgetting that there's the possibility and the power to extend it to other utilities that are supposed to be and are being currently regulated by the Fair Trading Commission. And let me add, in addition to the Fair Trading Commission, that board is usually made up of individuals who actually pay attention. So you have a board to whom the management and staff report, and you have a board who, as I understand it, the individual who's chairing that board right now is highly qualified in her area of expertise. I know her well. So that, why are we taking it from the FTC and giving it to the minister, but we're not seeing anywhere in a schedule what else is going to happen for regulation? So in that regard, sir, I'm concerned about this proposed amendment. I know it's dire, we have to fix pipes, we have to fix this, we need to do the books. If we get the books done, it's going to take too long. I get it. But in our quest to fix the dire situation, I'm always concerned about, all right, we can get back to it, or let's just do it now because it's urgent now. But when do we get back to it? And this is my segue into my next point, Mr. President. We also have a proposed Barbados Water Authority Validation of Water and Sewage Rates Act 2019. Well, it is a done thing, it's perennial if that's the word. This government charges taxes and then comes to Parliament to backdate the charge of taxes because if not, yeah, the collection of taxes is illegal. I have a challenge with it, but I did my research and it is okay. It doesn't sit well with me, but it is okay. You know why it doesn't sit well with me? You got 30 seats. What you busy doing? Why you can't get it together? Why we gonna keep fixing? And I don't mean in the terms of Senator Franklin. And I don't blame the Prime Minister when she speaks. Put it in place. We are always behind the eight. We are always catching up. You pass the legislation, one of the things that the government talked about is the 66 something laws that they passed over the last year. But we had rate increase that we've had to come in here as of the 21st of June to validate collection as of the 1st of May. Who else knew that they were going to be increasing but the government? So why wasn't the government ready? Why do we have to be fixing on the 21st of June something that came into effect on the 1st of May? That's my first issue. That's like when you fire somebody and then they got to come back for the papers. But you knew you were going to fire them. Be ready when they come so they don't have to come back on your premises. You know what I mean? But we have a situation where, first of all, we're playing catch up. And we did that last year in December with a number of pieces of legislation too, where we had to say this money that was collected whenever, 6 months ago or 3 months ago, is valid. Because if we didn't do that, then we would be in breach of another piece of legislation that says if you don't fix what the Prime Minister says in 3 months, it's null and void. You have the personnel, do it properly. But here's my concern. We have an increased rates, commercial rates for water. You've gone from 466 and 788, 778 commercial. But I recall, sir, that we were in this chamber on the 30th of July, 2018, and I was lamenting that we had a piece of legislation where we had proposed amendments to the Barbados Water Authority. It was the Barbados Water Authority Amendment Act 2018, where the law was changed whereby commercial consumers were being called upon to pay whatever the water they use plus 50% of their bill. And I then, almost a year to today, raised the fact that there was no provision for commercial consumers to apply to the relief board for relief. And my issue was, but what if we have a leak? According to the legislation, the $50,000 that Minister Frank, Senator Franklin. Senator Franklin spoke of his sister having a $15,000 bill. That is entirely possible when you have a leak. You're a commercial entity, you have a $15,000 leak. According to the legislation, a commercial consumer would then have to pay $15,000 plus half that is $7,500. Work it out, $22,500 for a leak. And there's no provision for commercial consumers in the legislation that we dealt with in July last year to apply to the relief board. I was promised, and I believe it was said in this chamber, that my point was taken and it would come back to us by October 2018. Well, we're heading to October 2019. So I say that to say, when you do things and in your quest to fix, and problems are discovered, let us even say that we use Senator McCartney's words, because she didn't say it today, but she does always say, look, we're trying to get it right. We found a mess. These are my words. I'm just praising. I don't want to misrepresent. But her basic premise is always, we may not get it right. Give us a minute. We're trying our best. We found a mess. But sometimes we might need to fix a couple things. Okay, fine. We're all human. You said you came and found a lot of confusion, a lot of mess. My issue is, though, that if we continue not to fix, what happens? So now you have increased the same consumer, the rates of the same consumer, who still does not have, as far as I'm aware, because it hasn't come back to this house, access to relief if they have a leak. Now, I have said it, I'm a commercial consumer by virtue of my practice. If I get a leak, I'm not paying the levy, because I want to be able to go to a board and say, listen, it was a leak, it was beyond my control. Please do not turn off my water, because then it's going to be a different outcome. But you have to do things correctly. To me, if you know you're coming for an increase in water rates for whatever reason, however justified, come on, deal with relief. You can't have a water bill and don't make provision for leaks. You can't be calling on the same consumers who you say or you believe can pay their utilities, but don't give them the protection of access to relief. That's what makes voting on some of these bills so challenging, because you have to weigh the good and the not so good. I don't want to say bad. But as a person who is particular about commas, oh, I thought you weren't going to look up. Oh, Mr. President, a person who's particular about commas, it would become more and more challenging to vote for a bill that has issues. You will encourage abstentions, because at the end of the day, the lawyers present have to be careful what they align and associate themselves with. Because when we then have to deal with them in the environment within which they are used, we would have contributed to something that has errors and issues. I find it somewhat morally confusing to me to increase my rate as a commercial consumer, but you have not taken the time almost a year later to address the issue of relief, even though you said you would. So why am I trusting you that whatever is right or wrong, you're gonna come back and fix it? You want me to vote, you want us to stand together for the good of the country, but you are giving me things that can be managed. Everything can't be managed, so you can't fix the accounts. I get it. But where's the amendment? You can hurriedly do amendments and come with 4 lines that gives a minister carte blanche to do whatever he likes with every utility company in this country. Don't mind me dealing with water today. You slip it in, and it's his for the taking or hers for the taking. That's a little dangerous, especially if you don't say what are the conditions that will inform his decision on rates. A rate hearing is public. You allow people to make oral or written submissions. They are looked at by a number of persons at the FTC, and then it is brought to the board, and you have persons who are qualified on the board to ask questions, and a decision is given. If you don't like the decision, there's an appeal process. Mr. President, you know about the appeal process. You know about the FTC going to court if necessary or being sued or whatever. So there is equity, justice, transparency. What are we doing, government? I have a little challenge with these 2 pieces of legislation, not because our situation isn't dire, I get it, but it's what you're asking us to say yes to. You have to stop telling me it's dire and ask me to say yes to something that when I say yes, I'm creating something that if not managed and if you have the wrong person in charge, could actually be a very dangerous piece of legislation for which you have no recourse because we said yes. You can do this, and there's no limit. You know those central bank acts that we had earlier that I didn't know anything about? I told you also. It still said up to the limit of and up to this and up to that. This ain't saying up to nothing. The amendment is 4 lines. The minister is king. That's what it says when it comes to utilities. But we still do not have provision or opportunity to seek relief if we have a leak. That seems to be, what's the big word? Senator Holders say incongruous. That's what she do. Use a small one. Yeah, I don't get it done as well as she does, sir. So, those are my concerns as it relates to the proposed 2 pieces of legislation, the Utilities Regulation Amendment Act and the Barbados Water Authority Validation of Water and Sewage Rates Act. The same amount of time you worked out the 4 lines, I gave you all the concerns, come back and tell me at the same time we putting in relief. You see how the Prime Minister here that people were having problems with land tax, and our Prime Minister from King's College come in and tell you all, okay, if you're landing 10%, payments, as long as you pay it before the 31st of March, waste no time, fix. It's a year. We were here 30th of July. What happened? What are we waiting on? The Prime Minister. I'm obliged to you, sir.
Senator Maynard?
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I have with me a document titled Stay the Course. And I would like to remind Senator Tate that there are promises within the document for relief. There is a promise by the government for relief with regard to the garbage and sewage levy. Because we will notice that when we have an increase in commercial rate for water, if your bill is calculated correctly, it's supposed to be, I think, 50% of the bill. it will mean there'll be a dramatic rise, not because of the water consumption and the rate, but because of the levy. But the Prime Minister made the commitment in the budget, in the proposal, to have some things in place within 60 days. It hasn't quite happened, but I hope that, as a Queen's College girl, as Senator Tate has said, that it will happen soon. Now, Senator Adams spoke of the threat, or the threats to our groundwater, and the fact that there is now brackish water in some of our wells that formerly had some of the tastiest water in Barbados. And Mr. President, that has probably resulted from how we have allowed development without consideration for all the consequences. And I don't think we can reverse it. What we are obligated to do is to make sure that it doesn't continue and it doesn't get any worse. Within the budget, the Prime Minister made lots of promises with regard to conservation. And the conservation part of it related to use of water. And it wasn't only considered that if you paid more for your water, you use less of it, but it also suggested that things like low volume flush toilets would help. And there appears to be a plan to help finance some of these changes in households, and also there's the promise of conservation by having households install water tanks, potable water tanks, when they have a square footage over 1,000 square feet. Mr. President, I do not know how that will conserve water. It's an expense. It might conserve energy for water authority, but not having to bring out water. But you will have to fill the tank. And it doesn't really conserve water. That's use of water that you've stored from the potable supply. We can save lots of water if we allowed persons to use roof water that's collected in an organized way to flush your toilets and use it to wash your clothes. I don't know for certain whether there is legislation in place that allows persons to plumb houses directly from the cisterns to the toilets, but maybe we need to look at it. Our water situation is not going to get any better. And as we develop and persons move into bigger houses and have greater demands for water, it will probably get worse. So we have to use all the water that we get in a sensible way and not waste it, including, Mr. President, consider what we do with our sewage water. There are cities that we travel to and we drink the water that is recycled from the sewer. We don't know it, but it is happening. Mr. President, on the space station, I promise you that all the water that is produced and used on the space station is constantly recycled. So we send large volumes of water into the sea, which we should probably be conserving. Now, Mr. President, we have been increasingly, I share Senator Tate's concern about the amendment where it appears as though by changing the legislation, there will be an open door to do anything within legislation. But given the situation, I think it's necessary. And I will support it. I hope, Mr. President, that every time we get into the Senate and we speak about water, that when we come back the next time, you can get up and say, well, we discussed that the cost of what the biggest cost in producing water was power. And we should be able to say, well, what have we done in the last 6 months to reduce the cost? Are we now being blinded by photovoltaics? Are we seeing wind turbines that are powering the pumping stations? What is happening? Who is updating us? Who is telling us? We have to live with water, Mr. President, and if the cost gets too high, it will become unaffordable, and the people who are most vulnerable will be the first ones to suffer. So we need to take measures to protect them. Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon to this honorable chamber. Water is a precious commodity. Some persons might say they've never heard that before. Water is not precious. Probably have said that water is not a commodity. What is a fact, regardless of what education or information you have as it relates to water, is that you're a living being. And from life experiences, you will recognize that all of us have been thirsty before. And by simply being thirsty, you have the natural instinct to want to hydrate, to want to have a drink of water. So by just life experience alone, you recognize, regardless of education as it relates to the conservation, the importance of water, you recognize by simply living that water is essential to all living organisms, all living human beings. Now, the bills that we're discussing today relates to the increase in the commercial rates in Barbados. That is what the two bills that we are discussing this afternoon relate to. Now, before we delve into that, we have to first understand that water is no fly-by-night issue. It is a serious issue that must be protected and must be treated with seriousness. Water is so important that in 2010, the human rights, the United Nations, at their last assembly in 2010, indicated that water and sanitation is a human right. At their assembly, they stated that the human right to water entitles everyone to sufficient, safe, acceptable, physically accessible, and affordable water for personal and domestic usage. Now, while that human right might not be expressly reflected in our constitution in Barbados, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do not believe that there is a human right to water in our constitution in Barbados. What is a fact is that the behavior of this country at a national level, we have recognized that our water supply, our water resource must be protected. And that is why in 1980, we enacted the legislation for the Barbados Water Authority. That is why we gave the Barbados Water Authority the responsibility for the supply of all of this island's water supply, and also to monitor, assess, control, and protect our water resources in the public's interest. That is why the Barbados Water Authority is here, to protect the public's interest as it relates to the control, assessment, monitoring, and provision of our water resources. Now, when the discussion was had in the other place by the Prime Minister in her budget speech, when she indicated that the commercial rates would be increased, there was some disquiet within the business sector of Barbados, and quite naturally so, because most persons hate to hear they will have to pay more for something. But this is not just any something. As you've heard in my preamble, This is an important something. This is about water. Water is what this increase is about. Now, the commercial rates were not increased in a vacuum. The Prime Minister and her team did not wake up one morning and decide, I feel like raising the tariff on commercial rates. That is not the case. That is not the case. So we can't come to our own conclusions without first understanding holistically. We have to have the background. We have to contextualize the situation before we can even come to a conclusion as it relates to whether or not the increases are indeed reasonable. Now, it is in that vein that I intend to make my brief presentation. Now, prior to the announcements by the Prime Minister in her speech, the companies in Barbados were paying approximately $4.66 per cubic meter for water, irrespective of the volume they use. $4.66, irrespective of the volume of water that they use. Now, on the face of that statement, it doesn't seem quite alarming. $4.66 for any amount of water, but that seems reasonable, that seems fair. But let us really examine the situation. Let us examine the situation. Commercial Barbados consumes the most water in this country. Commercial. Yes, Mr. President. Commercial Barbados consumes the most water in this country. Commercial Barbados includes hotels. And when I say hotels, hotels have a toilet, sink, and bathroom for each room. Some hotels have up to 60, 100 occupants per night. Sure. We're talking about condominiums. We're talking about cruise liners, aircrafts, agriculture, farming, pools, jacuzzis. The list goes on. There are a number of businesses which use high volumes of water. And all they're paying is $4.66 per cubic meter, irrespective of how much water they use. Now, this country is currently experiencing a drought. And I believe that Barbados has been classified as a water scarce country. So imagine that in a water scarce country, a country that is experiencing a drought, commercial businesses that use large volumes of water can basically carte blanche, turn on a tap and leave it and know that there are no repercussions for their actions because their rate remains the same. There's no cost to me wasting water. And as I said earlier, a vital source to life. There's no cost. There's no cost to the wastage. The situation is even further compounded by the fact that the rates that the commercial Barbados is paying is not just low in Barbados. A comparative analysis will show that even internationally, the rates are low. So we are basically, even though we're paying a nominal fee for the usage of water. A nominal fee is what commercial Barbados is paying for the use of water. Internationally, we still maintain low rates. The minister and a member of parliament in the other place, when he was making his presentation, indicated that he had a conversation with a person from commercial Barbados as it relates to water conservation. And he was told, basically from that conversation, that it was cheaper to turn on your tap and leave it and let it run than it was to invest in a water conservation mechanism. It was cheaper to waste water than to invest in a device that will assist you in saving water. The cost to put, so for instance, if you all went into the hotels, as I come to recognize now, there's these fancy gadgets that some hotels have now where you put your hand under the tap the water comes out. But as soon as you move it, it automatically shuts off. That is a water conservation mechanism. It moves away from the faucet turning, where you turn it and you forget it and you leave it to run forever, whereas the tap now automatically cuts off once you're no longer there. I think it has a time allocation, sensor time allocation. Apparently, it is expensive to go in that direction. So, as business people, like-minded business people would operate, they try to save costs. So why invest in a water conservation mechanism when it can simply waste water? There's no one here to penalize me. And as I have noticed in the past, despite the numerous publications from JS about the penalties that could be attached to the wastage of water, I hardly ever see it get enforced. So with that in mind, the lack of enforcement, there's no real way to monitor and force people to be compliant with the conservation of water. Now, to add further insult to our already dire situation, the commercial rate is $4.66 per cubic meter. The domestic rate is also $4.66 per cubic meter. However, the domestic rate is on a tariff. So you pay $466 per cubic meter between 20 and 40 cubic meters. But if you, $4.66 between 20 and 40 cubic meters. But if you go over that amount, the domestic user would now have to pay, would have had to pay then $7.78 per cubic meter. And this was happening for the last 9 years. So essentially what we would have had in Barbados is a culture where commercial Barbados, who uses the most amount of water, pays the least amount. And domestic Barbados, who basically uses probably for each household, 3 persons per household, a small nominal amount of water, is paying a significant amount on their bill. Clearly that cannot make sense. Clearly that is an anomaly, and it had to be rectified. It is not fair. It is illogical. The Barbados Water Authority has a number of challenges that it has to overcome if it truly wants to be able to live up to its mandate. Some of the challenges it has, it is now separated from central government. So it is now operating on its own. It has to generate its own source of funding. It has to generate its own revenue. That is where the Barbados Water Authority is at. And it is not impossible for it to do so, because it actually is probably one of the only SOEs we have that could potentially generate a true honest revenue. But it needs to be managed properly. The finances need to be managed properly. Not to go on a tangent, but for example, the $80 million or $60 million or whatever the true amount was to build the headquarters could have been better used to help rectify or improve the infrastructure that we need to replace today. We chose, rather than investing in infrastructure project works, to build a headquarters. But when I say we, I mean the government of the previous administration. Government of the previous administration. That is just a small example of how the funds that the government has through the Barbados Water Authority could have applied it differently towards effecting its mandate. Now, Barbados Water Authority is also owed roughly about $60 million from commercial Barbados, which means that Barbados Water Authority has to improve both its revenue collection as well as its debt collection. $60 million is way too much. That is something that the Barbados Water Authority has to address. And in a society where the water rates are nominal, that should never be an occurrence. Everyone should be paying the bill. Now, on top of the fact that the Water Authority is on its own, has a lot of persons who own it a lot of money, the actual infrastructure in which it manages is aging. The network is over 100 years old. Or more. Some persons even suggest it's over 120 years old. But we will use the wrong figure of 100 years old. And the problem with this, we have approximately about 2,500 kilometers in mains in Barbados. All of those mains collectively are old. Those mains carry the water throughout all of this country. If one main within the 2,500 kilometers is faulty or weak, it creates a different balance within the pressure that causes further pressure on the other mains. That is problematic. So, put it into perspective, if we repair 2 kilometers of a 2,500 kilometer main, the remaining kilometers, while they might not be as bad as the 2 we repaired, because we've repaired the existing 2, the pressure now has put the remaining kilometers under significant pressure, resulting in further leakage and breaks to the main, both underground and above the ground. So don't for a second think that because you walk along these streets that there's not some form of leakage or rupture to a main, because some do not manifest above the ground. So we walk above burst mains and don't know. And every day that is costing the BWA a lot of money. But we don't know this. We only complain about what we see. But we don't truly appreciate the dire situation in which the Barbados Water Authority is currently in. And it needs to rectify these problems now. Why? Because water is an important resource for us. Now, apart from the fact that we need to fix the mains, another issue is the cost. 1 kilometer in main is approximately $1 million. 2,500 is $2.5 billion. I know that the government does not have $2.5 billion to fix the mains. I know that $2.5 billion cannot be spent to fix the mains holistically in one go, which means whatever little bit of resources we generate, we still will enter into a cycle where we repair and still have issues with the existing. So in an ideal world, we would love to be able to replace all one time. But unless some generous person is willing to give an interest-free assistance to this country, we will still have problems trying to wrestle this water issue to the ground. $2.5 billion to fix the water mains is what we would need. And that would be the best option, because that's at today's rates. Now, the bottom line is that a lot of these mains are no longer fit for purpose due to the age, and one way or another, regardless if we like it or not, they all have to be replaced eventually. But it calls for proper management of funds and strategic thinking, strategic actions. So you identify the areas which have the major situations. And I understand over some time, over the last 9 years, persons in the northern part of Barbados have been experiencing difficulty in accessing water. Now, I would assume, or I would hope that at some point in time an assessment is done in that part of the country so that we can at least alleviate the issues with the northern side of the country. Because each person, as I said, has a human right to access to water. And I know that the Barbados Water Authority intends on making sure that each Barbadian has access to daily water. But we need to do this together. Because on the one hand, while the Barbados Water Authority may be able to provide the water, we can't just waste it. We can't just waste it. And the final point I would like to highlight as it relates to the Barbados Water Authority, because as I explained to you, it is in this vein that I want to stay in, the problems that the Barbados Water Authority is experiencing. Now, the Barbados Water Authority would pump 100% of water. So from the main station, they pump up 100% of water. But what actually gets into the faucets of both domestic and commercial Barbados is about 60%. of what is actually pumped out of the station, which means that we lose 40% of the water. It's unaccounted for. Could be through illegal connections, could be through the same leakages, but it's unaccounted for. Unaccounted for means that we still have to pay for 100% of the water production. We still have to pay the cost of producing 100% of water, but we are only generating revenue from 60% of it. So we operating at a loss from the get-go. We are already incurring an expense from the get-go, a 40% expense from the get-go. Again, problematic. The Barbados Water Authority has Barbados' best interests at heart, but it needs to have the room, the infrastructure, the necessary tools to be able to do what it was mandated to do. And the only way to get it done is through the generation of revenue. That is one of the only real ways in which the Barbados Water Authority can actually put a meaningful effort towards the protection and conservation of our water. So what I've done is just highlighted some of the major issues that are plaguing the Barbados Water Authority right now, so as to try to explain to you why the necessary increase, and I don't even like to use the word increase, because technically speaking, I call it an error. It was an error from the beginning, because it is no way that a commercial company, a commercial business, should have been paying from the get-go, from the start, less for water than a domestic user. So while it may appear to be an increase, all we are simply doing is rectifying an anomaly, rectifying an issue that should have never occurred. And even if it may be appearing to be an increase, the fact remains it is still a nominal fee when you look at it from an international perspective. From an international perspective. And because it is water and not just any other issue, something that none of us can survive without, it should be dealt with differently. We should be more open-minded to it, because we all need the water. As I started by saying, we might never get the education as it relates to why you should conserve water or why water is important. But one day you get thirsty, and the first thing you call for is a glass of water. And I would hate that this country deteriorates to a point where you turn on a faucet and it is dry, and throughout the entire country. Right now we are bad, but we are not. We could be in a worse position than we are in right now. And the Barbados Water Authority is going to make sure, through the implementation of this tariff, that we can generate the funds that are needed to try to wrestle the situation to the ground and start to slowly but surely repair the damage to the infrastructure, improve the infrastructure, and hopefully be able to provide a better service to Barbados. So with those few words, I'm obliged to you.
Mr. President, I beg to move that further consideration of this bill be postponed at this time.
Question is that further consideration of this bill be postponed. Honourable members in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. Move the adjournment.
Mr. President, I beg to move that the Senate do now adjourn. Sine die.
Question is that the Senate be now adjourned before the day appointed. All honourable members in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it.